Nora Kavanagh still carried her father's compass in the pocket of her nursing apron, though no rule of Mercy Hospital allowed it, and no sensible woman would have risked losing such a thing among basins and bandages. It was a small brass compass in a dented case, the kind lake captains carried before the big steamers made them feel old-fashioned. The glass had a flaw in one corner, like a frozen teardrop, and the needle trembled before it settled, the way a person trembles before telling the truth. Her father had put it in her hand the day she left for nurses' training in Milwaukee, 9 years ago now. He was already gray then, already coughing in the mornings, though neither of them said anything about that. He had closed her fingers over the brass case and told her that a sailor was never lost while he knew where north lay. She had thought he meant the lake. She had thought he meant storms and fog banks and the way the shore disappears when the snow comes down over the water like a dropped curtain. It took her 28 years and one terrible winter to understand that Captain Thomas Kavanagh had never once been talking about the lake. But that morning, the first Monday of December, 1898, in the town of Ashport, Wisconsin, she was not thinking about the compass at all. She was standing at the back of the long ward room of Mercy Hospital with the other nurses, half listening to Dr. Fenn, the superintendent, and trying not to be sick. The sickness had started 10 days before. She told herself it was the smell of carbolic, which had never bothered her in 7 years of service. She told herself it was the fish her aunt's cook had served twice that week. She told herself many things in the patient, reasonable voice she used with frightened patients, and she believed none of them because she was a nurse, and she could count weeks as well as any doctor, and the counting always came out the same. 5 weeks. 5 weeks exactly since Alice Riley's wedding up the shore at Eastman's Landing. 5 weeks since the veranda, and the man whose name she had never learned, and the one night in her whole careful life when she had let the current take her. Dr. Fenn was saying something about changes, about the hospital board and the growing town, and the need for a resident surgeon now that Dr. Aldous was past 70 and his hands were no longer to be trusted with a knife. The nurses stirred with interest. Ashport had 4,000 souls, a harbor, 2 sawmills, a tannery, and a fishing fleet. And men came off the boats and out of the mills broken in every way a body can break. A young surgeon was news. Katie Lynch, who stood beside Nora, whispered that she had heard he was from Chicago, from one of the great clinics, and that nobody could imagine what a man like that wanted with a town like theirs. Then Dr. Fenn turned toward the door of his office and said the new surgeon's name, and the man himself stepped into the wardroom, and the floor under Nora tilted like a deck. Dr. Nathaniel Ward, late of Chicago. Tall, dark hair cut shorter than she remembered it. A quiet, contained way of standing as if he were used to rooms going still around him. The same eyes, dark, attentive, with that particular stillness in them that she had spent 5 weeks trying to forget, and remembering instead every single night, the way the tongue returns to a sore tooth. He looked down the double row of nurses, the polite, measuring look of a man being introduced to his new staff. His gaze crossed hers. It stopped. 1 second. Perhaps 2. To Nora, it lasted approximately 100 years. Then something closed in his face, smoothly and completely, like a shutter drawn down over a lit window, and he inclined his head to them all and said he was glad to be among them, and Dr. Fenn led him away down the ward, pointing out the men's side and the women's side and the little operating room with its new white paint, of which the board was very proud. Nora stood where she was. Katie was saying something to her. The words came from a long way off, as if through water. She had given ether in that operating room for 7 years. Her hands were famous in the hospital for never shaking. Old Dr. Aldous liked to say that when the pulse fluttered and the blood came fast, Nurse Kavanagh grew calmer the way other people grew frightened. It was the one vanity she permitted herself. That morning, folding linen in the supply room where nobody could see her, she watched her own fingers tremble as if they belonged to some other woman, and she pressed them flat against the cold shelf until the trembling stopped. 5 weeks, and the father of the child she was carrying had just hung his coat in the office at the end of the corridor, and he had looked at her like a stranger. That evening she walked home the long way, along Harbor Street, past the chandlery and the net sheds, though the wind off the lake went through her coat like a knife. She wanted the cold. The cold was honest at least. It told you plainly what it was and what it would do to you. Her aunt's house stood on Prospect Avenue, 3 streets up from the water, white clapboard with green shutters and a parlor that smelled of beeswax and rectitude. Aunt Josephine Brandt had been born a Sullivan, had married upward into the Brant dry goods fortune, such as it was, and had spent the 20 years of her widowhood defending the family respectability the way a garrison defends a fort, with discipline, with vigilance, and with no mercy whatever for deserters. When Nora's father died, 5 years ago come March, of the pneumonia he took off the November lake, going out after the crew of a foundered scow when younger men would not, it was Josephine who had taken Nora in. Josephine reminded her of it seldom, which was worse than often. It sat in the house like a piece of furniture too large for the room. Everything Nora was in Ashport, a respectable unmarried woman of a respectable family, received in the better parlors, trusted at the hospital, stood on the narrow foundation of her aunt's good name. She knew, better than most women, what happened to those who slipped off that foundation. She had nursed them. Girls sent away to cousins upstate who did not exist. Girls dismissed from the woolen mill without a character. A housemaid from one of the big houses on the bluff who had drunk lye. 17 years old, and it had taken her 3 days to die, and the family she worked for had sent flowers. Nora sat at her aunt's supper table that night and answered questions about her day in a level voice and passed the pickled beets and thought, I am carrying a child by a man whose name I learned this morning at a staff meeting. And the little brass compass sat in her apron pocket, upstairs in her room, pointing north in the dark, as if that were any help at all. To understand what Nora Kavanagh did next, and what she did not do, which mattered more, you would have to understand what the lake had already taken from her, and what men had. Her mother she barely remembered, a warm shape, a smell of bread, a voice singing something Irish in the kitchen of the little house on Water Street. Bridget Kavanagh died of the typhoid the summer Nora turned 6, in the epidemic of '76 that came up out of the harbor wells. And after that it was Nora and the captain and the lake. Thomas Kavanagh was master of the schooner Petrel, carrying lumber and shingles from the North Shore mills down to Chicago, and he was known the length of the West Shore as a careful man. Not a timid man, there was a difference, he said, and woe to the sailor who confused the two. A timid man stays in port and rots. A careful man goes out, but he goes out knowing where north is, with his gear sound and his eyes open, and he brings his crew home. He raised his daughter the same way, as well as a man alone could. He taught her to read the sky off the water. He taught her that panic was the only storm that sank ships by itself. When she cut her hand to the bone on a fish knife at 10 years old, he did not carry on. He held the lamp steady and told her to look at the wound, not away from it, because a thing seen plainly was already half mended. She sewed people up for a living now. She supposed that was where it started. There had never been money. The schooner trade was dying all through her girlhood, squeezed slowly to death by the big steam barges, the freights dropping year by year, and the captain too proud and too old to go begging for a mate's berth on a steamer. But there had been the house, and the two of them, and in the evenings his voice reading the Milwaukee papers aloud while she mended, and that had been a kind of wealth she did not learn to price correctly until it was gone. She was 23 and 2 years a graduate nurse at Mercy the November he died. A lumber scow broke up on the bar north of town in a gale, and the life-saving crew was short-handed, and Thomas Kavanagh went out with the volunteers in a surfboat because he had never in his life stood on a beach and watched men drown. They brought all 5 of the scow's crew in alive. He was 3 weeks dying of what the icy water started in his lungs, in a bed by the window of his own house where he could see the weather. She nursed him herself. Days at the hospital, nights in the chair by his bed. Near the end, when the fever let him surface now and then like a man coming up between waves, he told her he was sorry there was nothing to leave her but the house, and the house mortgaged. She told him she had her profession. He said, and she remembered it word for word 5 years after, that a profession was a fine anchor, but an anchor was not the same thing as a harbor. She had the compass in her apron pocket that night, too. She had carried it every day since Milwaukee. He knew that, and he never asked for it back, not even to hold. After the funeral, the bank took the house on Water Street politely, the way banks did everything in Ashport, and Aunt Josephine appeared in her black silk and her certainty and announced that her brother-in-law had been a brave fool all his life and had died as he lived, and that Nora would come to Prospect Avenue, where at least the roof was paid for. It was not unkindly meant. Josephine Brant did nothing unkindly. She did it correctly, which was different and sometimes worse. And then there had been Frank Colby. It embarrassed Nora now, what a small story it made, laid out plainly. A teller at the First National Bank with good teeth and a gift for saying the thing you hoped to hear. 2 years of Sunday walks and concert evenings, and one Christmas a ring. Modest, he explained, because his prospects were still building. And she, who had never had money, thought a modest ring an honest one. The spring before the wedding was to be, the cashier of the First National made it known that his daughter Eugenia would come into the shares her grandfather left her upon her marriage. By June, Frank's prospects had built. He returned from a bank picnic engaged to Eugenia Pratt, and he came to the house on Prospect Avenue to tell Nora himself, and he had the extraordinary courage to call it being fair with her. She had not wept in front of him, she had that much. She gave back the ring and said she hoped he would be happy in the manner of a woman closing a door, quietly, so the latch barely clicks, because slamming it would suggest the room beyond still mattered. The town watched, of course. The town always watched. Aunt Josephine conducted herself as if a small business venture had failed through no fault of the family's, and let it be known that Nora's devotion to her nursing had simply left the young man feeling neglected, a version that spared everyone except Nora, who had to wear it. That was 2 years past. Frank Colby was assistant cashier now. His wife wore Chicago dresses to the Congregational Church and had a way of looking at Nora across the aisle, brief and satisfied, the way a woman checks a sum she has already verified twice. And Nora had gone on. That was the whole of it. She was good at going on. She rose in the dark and walked down the hill to the hospital, and gave the ether drop by drop, counting, watching the pulse in a stranger's throat, being the steadiest thing in the room. The work was real. Pain was real, and so was its relief. A mended man walked out the door and shook your hand, and there was nothing false in any of it, which could not be said of Sunday walks and modest rings. If sometimes, coming home along Harbor Street in the summer dusk, past the lit windows of other people's suppers, something in her chest pulled hard toward those yellow squares of light, she treated it the way she treated her own weariness in the 14th hour of a shift. Noted it, set it aside, kept her hands moving. 2 years of that. She had begun to believe it was a life, and that she was, if not happy, then something adjacent to it and nearly as durable. Then Alice Riley, who had trained beside her in Milwaukee and married a harbor master's clerk up at Eastman's Landing, sent a wedding invitation for the last Saturday of October, written in her round, hopeful hand with a line at the bottom. "You will come, Nora. I won't hear otherwise. You have hidden long enough." Nora meant to send regrets. She composed them twice. Then she stood in her room on a Tuesday evening with the regrets half written and caught sight of herself in the glass, 28, in gray worsted, her dark red hair pinned so tight it pulled, and some voice that sounded more like her father than herself said, "A careful man goes out." She burned the regrets in the grate and wrote that she would come. Eastman's Landing was 3 hours up the shore by the morning train, a fishing town smaller than Ashport, with one good hotel, the Lakeview House, where the wedding supper and dancing were held after the church. Alice made a glowing bride. Her clerk looked at her as though she were the harbor light itself. Nora was glad she had come, and said so, and meant it, and by 10 o'clock she had smiled until her face ached, and answered 11 times that no, she herself was not married, she was wedded to her work, and the parlor was hot, and the fiddles were loud, and a cousin of the groom's with damp hands had twice asked her to dance. She slipped out onto the hotel veranda, the one facing the water, where the lamps did not reach. A man was standing at the rail, tall, bareheaded, his coat open despite the cold, the small red star of a cigarette rising and falling. She would have gone back inside. She had had her fill of talking, but he spoke without turning, in a low voice, and what he said was that she had escaped too, then. She said she had only come out for air. He said that was what he had been telling himself for an hour. She laughed, surprised into it, and that was how it began. Nothing began it. That was what she came back to, all the weeks after, lying awake. There was no flattery, no maneuvering, none of the small machinery she had learned to watch for. Just the dark and the cold, clean smell of the lake, and 2 voices. He was a friend of the groom's people. He had come up from Chicago for the single day. A doctor, a surgeon, she gathered, though he said it plainly, without the usual polish. When she said she was a nurse, an anesthetist, he did not say anything gallant about angels of mercy. He asked her, seriously, how she judged the depth of the ether sleep, and listened to the answer, and asked a further question that showed he had actually heard the first one. She could not remember the last time a man had done that. And then, because it was dark, and because strangers on a cold veranda can say to each other what they cannot say at their own tables, he told her about his mother. She was dying, in Chicago, of a cancer that had gone too far before it declared itself. Weeks, the doctor said, perhaps less. He was a surgeon, and there was nothing in his hands or anyone's for it, and he had sat by her bed a month watching her go and being entirely useless, and it was his mother who had ordered him up here to stand at his friend's wedding. Life must not stop, she had told him. She had made him promise to dance at least once. He had not managed it yet, he said. It seemed the fiddles were always too quick for him. Nora did not tell him it would be God's will, or that where there was life there was hope, or any of the other coins that are pressed into the hands of the grieving. She knew their exact value. She stood beside him at the rail, and after a while she said that her father had died in the room where she was born, 3 weeks dying, and that she had been his nurse, and that she had learned there was a kind of watching that was itself a work, even when the hands were idle. That being present was not nothing, that it was in fact nearly everything, and the dying knew it. He was quiet a long moment. Then he said she was the first person in a month who had not tried to comfort him, and that it was the most comfort anyone had given him. The cold drove them in eventually, but only as far as the little writing room off the hotel parlor, where a fire was dying in the grate and the dance music came through the wall soft as weather. They talked. She could not afterward have made a full accounting of what about. The lake, Chicago, the Wards, a professor in Milwaukee they discovered they had both suffered under, which made them laugh like conspirators. He asked how a lake captain's daughter came to the ether cone, and she found herself telling him about her father, the petrel, the surfboat, the 3 weeks by the window. She had never told it whole to anyone. Aunt Josephine considered grief a private untidiness, like unbrushed hair. At some point she showed him the compass. She had not planned to. It was simply that her hand went to her pocket the way it did when she spoke of her father, and he noticed, and asked, and she laid the little brass case on the table between them. He picked it up as if it were a living thing. He turned it until the needle steadied, and asked what her father had meant by North, because, he said, men who gave such gifts always meant something by them, and rarely the obvious thing. No one had ever asked her that. She said she supposed she was still finding out. He nodded slowly, and said that was the correct answer to nearly everything. She was 28 years old. She had been kissed by exactly 2 men in her life, one of whom had married bank shares. She knew precisely what the world was, and what it forgave, and what it did not, and to whom its forgiveness was rationed. She sat in the dying firelight of a hotel writing room with a man whose name she had somehow never gotten around to asking, at first because names had seemed beside the point, and later because the not knowing had become a kind of spell neither of them was willing to break. And she understood, with the clear-eyed calm she was famous for, that she was going to break every rule she had lived by, and that she would rather do that than go back to her cold room and her going on. Her father had said panic was the only storm that sank ships by itself. He had never said anything at all against sailing. She was not going to set down here, for anyone, what the rest of that night was. It belonged to her. It was the one thing in this story that was never anyone else's business, not the town's, not her aunt's, and it stayed clean in her memory through everything that came after. One night in a narrow hotel room with the lake talking against the pilings below the window, when she had been, for the only time she could remember, entirely without armor and entirely unafraid. She fell asleep toward morning with her hand in his. When she woke, the light was gray and the room was empty. No note on the washstand, no card. Nothing in the room but her own things and the dent in the pillow beside her, already cooling. She sat very still for a long time, the way one sits after a blow, waiting to find out where the pain will be. Then she rose and washed and pinned her hair and went down the back stair of the Lakeview house with her chin level, and caught the early train and looked at the lake the whole 3 hours and did not cry. So that is what it was, she told herself, somewhere past Sheboygan. Now you know. They are all the same coin, only some are minted brighter. It did not occur to her, why would it, that a man might have a reason. She had been given her education in men by Frank Colby, and the first lesson of that education was that when they go, and the kindest of them leaves a speech about fairness, and the others leave a cooling dent in a pillow. From the station she did not even go home. It had been arranged for weeks that she would spend her fortnight's leave with her cousin Maureen in Green Bay, who was expecting her 4th and needed help. Nora had her valise with her, and changed trains, and was gone from Ashport for 2 full weeks. She was grateful for it. Maureen's kitchen was loud and warm and full of children, and there was no time to think, and at night she was too tired to lie awake more than a quarter hour. By the time she came home to Prospect Avenue in mid-November, she had folded the whole thing away, the veranda and the fire and the compass turning in his hands, folded it small, and put it where she kept her father's voice and her mother's singing, things that were over. 10 days later the sickness began in the mornings, and the counting started, and would not come out any way but one. And 10 days after that, Dr. Fenn stood up at the Monday meeting and introduced the new resident surgeon, late of Chicago. The weeks that followed were a lesson in how large a small hospital can be made if two people are determined to make it so. Mercy Hospital was 40 beds, 2 wards, 1 operating room, a dispensary, and a corridor you could walk end to end in 40 seconds. Nora learned to walk it at the hours he did not. She traded shifts with Katie Lynch, pleading her aunt's health, her own teeth, a dressmaker. She took her dinner early or not at all. She learned the sound of his step, quick, even, with a slight pause at thresholds, and could be occupied elsewhere by the time it reached her. He did the same. She saw that clearly, and it told her everything, and what it told her sat in her chest like a swallowed stone. When duty forced them together, a dressing, a chart, a question of morphia, he was courteous, exact, and impersonal, a colleague addressing a colleague. Nurse Kavanagh. Dr. Ward. 2 nods a day in a corridor. Once, handing her a chart, his fingers brushed hers, and both of them stood for a moment as if a wire had touched them. And then he said something about the patient's fever curve, and she said something about the night orders, and they went their 2 directions down the 40-second corridor. So it was to be as if nothing had happened. Very well. She had been schooled for that too. Nothing was, after all, her aunt's native language. Meanwhile, inside her, the something went on happening. She kept her secret the way she kept sponge counts, with method. She was careful at breakfast, careful on the stairs, careful in the mornings, when the smell of frying could undo her. She learned that a soda biscuit eaten before rising settled the worst of it, and kept a tin of them behind the books in her room like contraband. She let out the waist seam of her gray dress one evening by lamplight, half an inch, her stitches small and even, her mind refusing the arithmetic of how many more inches the winter would ask, and how soon the letting out would stop being enough, and what then? There was no what then. Every road out of what then was posted with the faces of girls she had nursed. In the second week of December, she took the Saturday train down to Manitowoc, where nobody knew her, and consulted a doctor there under her mother's maiden name, a stout old German with kind, uncurious eyes who told her what she already knew, that she was healthy, that the child was well begun, that she should expect it in the first part of July. He asked no questions about a husband, which was its own answer to how often he had learned not to. When she paid him, he held her fee a moment and told her, in his slow English, that she was strong, and that strong was more use than lucky in his experience, though he wished her lucky also. She rode home in the winter dusk with her forehead against the cold glass, and somewhere along the shore, between the lighthouse at 2 Creeks and the first lights of home, she stopped thinking of it as her ruin and began thinking of it as her child. She could not afterwards say how the change came, only that the low sun came out under the clouds for a minute over the water, the way it does in December, sudden and gold and gone, and she put her hand flat on the front of her coat, and the word that rose in her was not trouble, it was you. After that, she was not sorry. Frightened, every hour, with a fear that had no bottom, but not sorry. It was worth remarking, she thought, that of everything she carried that winter, the one thing that never felt like a burden was the child. The town, of course, was carrying on its own investigations, not of her, not yet, but of him. A new unmarried surgeon of 32 was the richest event in Ashport since the tannery fire. The ladies of the Wednesday Aid Society established within a fortnight that he had come from a great clinic on the north side of Chicago, that he had buried his mother in November, poor man, that he took his meals at Mrs. Hollander's boarding house on 3rd Street and kept no company, that he was civil to everyone and warm to no one, and that Dr. Fenn had confided he could not fathom why a man with such hands had answered the advertisement of a 40-bed Laketown hospital when Chicago would surely have kept him and paid him triple. Nora sat through these recitals at her aunt's tea table with her eyes on her sewing. Buried his mother in November. The words went through her the first time she heard them, a long, cold needle. She thought, so it was true then, the dying mother. And on the heels of that, unbidden, disloyal to her own hurt, he was standing on that veranda a week from losing her, and he spent the night giving comfort to me. She put the thought out, she had to. It threatened the only version of events she could afford, which was the Frank Colby version. They go because they are made that way, and reasons are what they leave instead of notes. She could carry the child, the secret, the fear, the corridor, all of it, but only if the ground under her stayed simple. If she once let herself imagine that the man 2 doors down the corridor was something other than false, that the night had been to him what it had been to her, then she would have to ask why he had gone without a word, and the asking would crack her open in a place she could not afford to be cracked. So she did not ask. She starched her aprons and counted her weeks, and was the steadiest thing in the room. It was Mrs. Pruitt who noticed first, because Mrs. Pruitt noticed everything. It was her profession and her nature, and 30 years at Mercy had worn the two into one. Agatha Pruitt was the hospital matron, 58 years old, built like a lighthouse and about as easy to deceive. She had trained half the nurses on the West Shore and buried 2 husbands and 1 son, and what she did not know about trouble had never yet been invented. One gray afternoon, just before Christmas, she came upon Nora leaning against the wall of the sluice room with her eyes shut and a face the color of tallow, and stood studying her, arms folded, for a good 5 seconds before Nora heard her and straightened and said something about the stove smoking. The matron said the stove drew as well as it had in 30 years. Nora said she was perhaps a little worn. It had been a long autumn. Mrs. Pruitt looked at her, one long, level, terrible, kind look, a look with 30 years of sluice rooms behind it, and said that in her experience the autumn did not usually last into July. Then, while Nora stood absolutely still, the matron took a step closer and said, in a voice suddenly quiet, that she would say the one thing she had to say and then be done saying it, that a wound sewn over dirt heals rotten. Every nurse knew it of wounds, she said, and hardly 1 woman in 10 knew it of her own life. Whatever was under the skin, she said, would have to come to air before it could mend. She did not ask what, and she did not ask who. And until that day, Nurse Kavanagh might count on it that the matron of this hospital had grown very hard of hearing and did not repeat gossip, having no talent for it. And she went out of the sluice room and said not 1 word more on the matter, then or after, though from that week the heavy lifting on Nora's ward went somehow always to the orderlies, and the fainting hot laundry duty passed her by, and nobody could have proved a thing. Nora stood among the basins for a long while after, and discovered that kindness was harder to bear than suspicion. Suspicion she had braced for. The matron's rough mercy went in under all her bracing, and that evening, for the first time since Eastman's Landing, she cried, silently, efficiently, sitting on the edge of her bed with her boots still on, one hand over her mouth, and the other flat against the little curve that did not yet show under a well-cut dress. Then she washed her face and went down to supper, because it was Thursday, and on Thursdays her aunt received callers, and the Kavanaghs of this world are at table when expected. Christmas at the house on Prospect Avenue was conducted, like everything there, correctly. A goose, a tablecloth that had crossed from Bremen in 1852, the good Haviland china, and company. This year, besides the minister's sister and the Wagners from next door, a Mr. Cyrus Hobart of Hobart & Sons, Lumber and Coal. Mr. Hobart was 46, a widower of 2 years, pink, solid, and prosperous, with a brick house on the bluff and 3 half-grown children in need of a mother's hand. He said grace at some length. He had opinions on the tariff and shared them. Twice during dinner Nora caught her aunt watching her and Mr. Hobart in alternation, with the expression of a woman checking a seam she has just pinned. It was made plain to her afterward, in the way such things were made plain on Prospect Avenue, obliquely, over the dismantling of the goose, in the third person. Josephine observed that a woman of Nora's age stood at a particular corner, from which the streets ran in exactly 2 directions. That nursing was a credit in a girl and a warning in a woman of 30. That Mr. Hobart had asked after her twice since the harvest concert, and had remarked to Mrs. Wagner that Miss Kavanagh had a settled way about her, which a man in his position valued above prettiness. That some women were offered a first boat and missed it, and were offered a second boat, and stood on the pier fussing about the first one until the water was empty to the horizon, and that her aunt did not intend to watch that happen twice under her own roof, out of affection for a dead sister, if nothing else. Nora looked down the length of the cleared table at this woman who had housed her and clothed her grief and decency, and never once embraced her in 5 years, and she thought, with a calm that surprised her, "You are arranging the marriage of a woman who will be visibly with child by Easter." The thought was so enormous, and sat so quietly among the walnut shells and the good china, that she nearly laughed. It would have been the end of everything, that laugh. She held it the way she held her breath in the operating room, counting, and said she was sensible of Mr. Hobart's merits, and might they speak of it after the new year. It bought her 14 days. She went up to her room and stood a long time at the window, looking down the hill at the dark harbor, and understood that the ice she stood on had begun, softly, everywhere at once, to sing. A secret of this kind, her father would have said, is November weather. You may be granted a fine week, even two, but the season has turned, and what is coming, and a careful man does not spend the fine week pretending. He spends it getting his boat in. She had no boat. She had $140 in the savings bank, a profession that would dismiss her the day her waist declared itself, a compass and a tin of soda biscuits behind the books. It was that night, the night of the goose and Mr. Hobart, that she first sat down and began the letter. Not to anyone living, that was beyond her. She took her writing case and a sheet of plain paper and wrote at the top, "Dear Papa." She had done it once before in her life, the month after the funeral, on a black night. It had helped then, and she had burned the letter after and told no one, because it was a foolishness, and because it was the only confession her circumstances allowed. A Catholic girl could go to the priest. A luckier girl could go to a mother, a sister. Nora Kavanagh had a graveyard and a compass, so she wrote to the graveyard. She wrote it all down plainly, as he had taught her to look at wounds, what she had done and not done, the veranda and why she had stayed, that she was not able to be sorry, that she was afraid the way she had never been afraid in any storm of theirs, that the man was here now, 40 seconds' walk down a corridor, and looked at her like a stranger, and that she did not know whether the child would ever have more of a father than she could be alone. That she thought about the harbor and the anchor, that she missed him, this last very quick, the pen digging in. She did not burn this letter, she meant to, but burning it felt, obscurely, like burning a hand that held hers, and instead she folded it small and pushed it deep into the inner pocket of her nursing apron, under the compass, where it stayed, through the laundering she did herself, moving it each time, like a stone she had decided to carry instead of swallow. It was a bad habit for a tidy woman, carrying such a paper into such a building. She knew it. She carried it anyway. We are none of us tidy all the way through. January came in hard, with the harbor frozen out past the light and the mills running short time. The hospital filled with the winter's regular tithe, crushed fingers from the ice houses, croup, a lad off the breakwater with a broken ankle, old men's pneumonia. Nora saw Dr. Ward daily now. The wards were too busy for choreography, and the strange double life of the corridor settled into something almost bearable, the way a splinter settles, fair weather between aches. And she watched him. She could not help it. And the watching taught her things she had not bargained for. She watched him sit up 2 nights running with the tanner's wife after the woman's operation, when he might have left it to the nurses, because the husband was on a delivery run to Green Bay, and the woman was frightened of the dark. She watched him take out a fishhook barb from the thumb of a Norwegian deckhand who had no English and less money, and refuse the man's crumpled $50 with a shake of the head and a joke in dumb show that made the giant laugh like a boy. She heard from Katie, who heard everything, that the new surgeon had quietly paid Mrs. Hollander for the board of the breakwater lad's mother, who had come in from the county to sit with her son and had nowhere to stay. None of this fit the Frank Colby version. Frank's kindnesses had all had audiences. This man did his in corners and was caught at it, and looked, when caught, faintly annoyed. And once, one evening in the 3rd week of January, she came around the corner of the corridor and found him standing at the window at the end, the one that looked west up the hill, where between the Methodist steeple and the courthouse cupola you could just see the bare trees of the cemetery. He was not reading the chart in his hand. He was looking up the hill, and his face had forgotten to be a doctor's face. And what was on it instead was so bare, so lost, so exactly the thing she had seen by firelight in a hotel writing room in October, that she stopped dead on the drugget. He heard her and turned, and for 2 full seconds neither of them managed the masks in time. He said her name, her surname, Nurse Kavanagh, but half a beat late, as if another word had been sent back at the door. She asked, because the silence had to be filled with something, whether he wanted the night orders read to him. He said yes, thank you, and did not hear one word of them. She read them and did not either. That night she lay awake and let herself ask, for the first time, the forbidden question. Why does a man look up a hill at a cemetery in that fashion? And why does a man leave a great clinic in Chicago for 40 beds in Ashport? And the ground under her, the simple ground she had been standing on since the gray morning at the Lakeview house, shifted very slightly, with a sound like ice singing, and she did not know whether what was under it was water or solid stone, and she was afraid to find out. It was a fortnight yet before she learned that the answer to all her questions was lying up that hill under the snow, with a headstone not 2 months old. Helen Marsh Ward, born in this county 1840, and that the man at the window had been looking all along at the one appointment he had kept too late. The night that broke it open came at the end of January, and it came, as such nights do, on the run. It was a Sunday, past 10, sleet rattling the Ward windows, when the Novak boy was brought in. Stanislaw Novak, Stashu, the whole East End called him, 8 years old, son of a Polish mill hand from the flats below the tannery. 3 days of bellyache that his mother had treated with peppermint and prayer, because the mill was on short time and a doctor was $1. Then the sudden ease that every surgeon fears worse than screaming. Then the fever, and the rigid little belly, and the father running the whole way up Harbor Street through the sleet with the boy in his arms, having heard that the new doctor did not always ask about the $1 first. Appendicitis far gone and the poison loose in him. Even 5 years earlier the boy would simply have died, with the priest sent for and the neighbors bringing bread. But it was 1899, and the operation existed, and the surgeon existed. 40 seconds down the corridor, and Dr. Ward had his coat off before the father finished talking. Nora was the night anesthetist on call. There was no arranging around it, and neither of them tried. There is a level below all private weathers, and the operating room is its floor. She remembered that hour and a half all her life, the way one remembers not scenes but temperatures. The white room hissing with lamplight. The boy's ribs under her hand, quick and shallow as a bird's. The father's face at the door as it closed, holding on to her eyes for 1 second. She had seen that look on shipwrecked beaches, and then the work. She gave the ether drop by patient drop, her fingers at the small blue wrist, counting the pulse against her father's compass-steady hand inside her, and called the numbers low, the pulse, the breathing, the color. Dr. Ward worked fast and clean and utterly silent. No lecture, no temper, only now and again a single word. Sponge, ligature, now. And she found that she knew what he needed a half a second before he said it, and had it moving toward his hand. They had never once worked a case together. It made no difference. It was the veranda over again in a terrible key. Two strangers who were somehow not strangers, doing together in perfect time the one thing each of them did best. The trouble came at the worst place. The boy's pulse faltering just as the wound lay open at its gravest, a flutter, a skip, the small face going the color of the sheet. She said the numbers once, flatly. The room went very still, and in that stillness, without looking up from his work, Dr. Ward said quietly that he had the time he needed if she could hold the boy for 3 minutes, and that he had never yet seen her fail to hold anyone. 8 words of it were fact and the rest was faith, and none of it was in any textbook, and it steadied her hands like her father's voice. She held the boy. Ether lightened, chin lifted, the little chest coaxed along, her whole mind narrowed to a bird's heartbeat. 3 minutes. 4. And then the flutter smoothed, and the color crept back, and Dr. Ward's shoulders came down a 1/4 inch, and he closed, and it was over. And the clock on the wall said not 2 hours had passed, which was absurd. The boy would live. They knew it by 3 in the morning, when the fever turned. Dr. Ward went out to the corridor bench where the mill hand sat gray as ash between 2 rosaries, his own and his wife's, sent along, and told him, through the night porter's clumsy German that the Pole half understood, that his son would keep. The man took the surgeon's hand in both of his and bowed over it, and could not speak, and did not need to. Nora saw that from the door of the nurse's room, and then she went inside where no one could see her, and sat down hard on the wooden chair by the stove, because her legs had finished their shift before she had. The reaction took her the way it always took her, an hour late and all at once. The shaking she never allowed in the white room arriving now with interest, her body remembering the bird heartbeat, and beneath that, deeper, the other thing. She had spent 2 hours a foot from him across a dying child, breathing in time with him, and it had felt like the only honest conversation they had had since October. She was so tired. She was 3 months gone, and it was 3 in the morning, and she was so mortally tired of carrying everything in pockets. She unpinned her apron, it was fouled, past wearing, and pulled it off over her head, and was folding it inside out by rote when it happened. The inner pocket, loosened by months of her own secret traffic, gave up its cargo. The compass struck the boards with a crack and spun, and the letter, the folded, refolded, carried, damned letter, slid out after it, glanced off her knee, and came open on the floor at the fold like a thing performing its purpose at last. She was bending for it, too slow, her body still on shift lag, when the door opened. He had come to tell her about the fever's turn. His mouth was already shaping something ordinary, and then he saw her face, which had gone to chalk, and looked where she was looking, and stooped, courteously, automatically, a man picking up a lady's dropped things, and had the compass in one hand and the letter in the other before she got out the single word, "Don't." He would have given it back unread. She believed that afterward, and it mattered to her. But the letter had fallen open, and her writing was large and clear, the nurse's hand that night orders had to be read from across a lamplit room, and some words do not need reading. They leap. Dear Papa leapt, and below it, in the middle of the sheet where the fold had split the light, the line she had dug into the paper in December leapt too. The words, "His child," and the words, "Eastman's Landing," and the words, "Since October I have been alone with it." She watched it strike him. She had spent 7 years watching faces take blows in that building. The corridor faces, when the news came out of the White Room, and she watched this one take it standing. The doctor's composure not falling but failing in patches, like ice going off a window in a thaw. He looked at the letter he was not reading, and at the compass in his other hand, the little brass case he had turned by firelight until the needle steadied, and she saw him do the arithmetic she had done alone in a cold bedroom in November, and arrive. He asked, and his voice when it came was not angry, it was worse, it was careful, the voice a man uses when everything in him is being held with both hands, whether it was his. She was too far past pretending, and too proud to try. She said yes. He asked why she had not told him. It was scarcely a question, it came out cracked in the middle. And Nora Kavanagh, who had held the whole winter in her two steady hands, heard her own answer come out at last, not level at all, the words falling anyhow, like the letter. Because he had gone. Because she had woken to a dented pillow and no word, not one, and she had learned once already at what price a woman believes a man's leaving means anything but leaving. Because he had stood in that wardroom in December and looked at her like a stranger, and she had a position and an aunt and $140, and girls she had nursed had drunk lye for less trouble than she was in. Because, and here her voice finally went to pieces entirely, because she could survive his going a second time, but not if he took anything more of her with him when he went. And now he had the whole of it in his 2 hands anyway, the letter and the compass and all. The stove ticked. Down the corridor, a child who was going to live muttered in his sleep. He stood a long moment looking at her, and of everything he might have said, what he said, very low, was that she was wrong about one thing only, but it was the largest thing, and he could not say it in a hospital at 3 in the morning with her half dead on her feet, that it required daylight and time, and he was asking her for both. He needed, she saw the word cost him, he needed to think how to say it, because he had done everything wrong since December that a man could do, and he did not intend to do this wrong as well. Then he set the compass in her hand, and the letter beside it, unread, folded shut, and he went out. 3 days he did not come to her. 3 days of nods in the corridor, of the Novak boy mending pink and loud in the children's cot by the stove, of Katie wondering aloud what ailed the surgeon, who looked like a man sitting in examination. 3 days in which Nora swung hourly between a hope she cursed herself for and the old gray certainty, and settled by the 3rd evening on the certainty, because it was load-bearing and hope was not. So of course it was the 3rd evening, coming off shift into the black cold with her shawl over her cap, that she found him standing at the hospital gate under the lamp, hat in his hands, waiting. He asked if she would walk with him, not to Mrs. Hollander's, not to any parlor where the town had eyes, down Harbor Street toward the water, where the lamps ran out and the piled ice groaned along the breakwater, and the cold was hard enough to guarantee privacy to anyone mad enough to want it. It was, she thought, the first sensible arrangement either of them had made since October. The whole thing had begun in the cold and the dark at the edge of water, and if it was to be mended at all, it would not be mended under a lamp. They walked, and he talked, at first with the awful stiffness of a man who has rehearsed, and then, when the rehearsal ran out somewhere past the net sheds, plainly, and she heard at last the accounting of that October morning, and the ground she had stood on all winter went out from under her not like ice breaking, but like a tide coming in, slowly, from every side at once. There had been a telegram. It had come to the Lakeview house at 4 a.m, the night porter's knuckles on the door, the yellow envelope, the wire from his mother's sister in Chicago. Sinking fast, come at once. And the morning boat, the only boat, the steamer that connected at Manitowoc with the Chicago night run, left the landing pier at 20 minutes to 5. He had, he said, perhaps 90 seconds to decide, standing in that dark room with his boots in his hand, and he had decided wrong in every direction at once. He had not woken her. She was sleeping the first untroubled sleep he had watched anyone sleep in a month, and he had a coward's tenderness about it, and he told himself he would write from the pier. At the pier there was no paper, no light, no porter, and the boat already swinging her stern out. He told himself he would write from Chicago. He reached Chicago at dusk. His mother had died at noon. What came after, he said, he could give her only in pieces because it existed in his memory only in pieces. The undertaker's rooms, his aunt weeping, papers and more papers. The funeral on a Black Branch morning in a cemetery by the North Shoreline with a wind off the water so bitter the minister cut the psalm short. He was told he bore it well. He had no memory of bearing it at all. He had a memory of standing at a graveside doing sums, the sums a man does when it is too late for anything but arithmetic. That if he had not gone to the wedding, he would have had 5 more days with her. That if the wire had come 1 hour earlier, he would have caught the earlier connection. That he had traded his mother's last mourning for a stranger's wedding, and had gotten, in the trade, one night that he could not make himself regret, and the shame of that had nearly finished him. She stopped walking when he said that. He stopped too, and in the dark she heard him take the cold air in like a man surfacing and go on. Because there was the other thing, he said. All through that black November, in rooms full of condolence, one memory had kept a lamp lit in him, and it was a hotel veranda where a woman he had known 3 hours had stood beside his grief without once trying to talk him out of it. He had left that woman a dented pillow for a farewell. He knew what she must think of him. He had had 90 seconds and chosen wrong, and every day that passed made the wrong less mendable. And he had set out to find her with almost nothing in his hands. Her Christian name, her profession, some scraps from the wedding table, that she had trained in Milwaukee, that she worked in a lake town somewhere south along the shore. He had written to the groom, who consulted the bride, and the bride, Alice, loyal Alice, protecting her friend from what she took for a masher's inquiry, had answered with a chill that he had understood and even honored, that Nora's whereabouts were Nora's affair. He had written to the training school in Milwaukee, which did not give out the situations of its graduates. He had, in the last week of November, sat down with a shipping map of the West Shore and a medical directory and begun writing to hospitals, town by town. She would laugh, he said, if she ever saw the list, or perhaps she would not laugh, asking after an anesthetist, a Miss Nora, and there the letters had to stop, because he had no surname to put in the blank, and the letters read like exactly what Alice had taken him for. And then he had stopped looking by letter, because a different door opened. His mother's affairs, when the lawyers finished, included a last instruction he had been half expecting. She wished to lie not in Chicago, but at home, in the county where she was born, where her people were, a place she had left at 19 and talked of all his boyhood the way other women talk of the old country. A town called Ashport on the Wisconsin shore. He had brought her north on the cars the first week of December and buried her on the hill under the bare trees, and standing in that cemetery, he said this evenly, like a man reporting a clinical fact he has checked 3 times. He had understood that he could not go back to Chicago, to the clinic and the gaslit flat and the sums. And the county paper, which he read at the hotel because grief reads anything, carried on its second page the advertisement of the Mercy Hospital Board, wanted, a resident surgeon. He had told himself it was for his mother's sake, to be near the grave. He had told himself a 40-bed hospital would be a rest cure. He had told himself everything, he said, except the one thing a man of science ought to have examined first, that the advertisement said the town had a hospital, and hospitals have anesthetists, and hope is a diagnostician that works in the dark. And then the first Monday morning, Fenn's office, the wardroom, the double row of caps, and her face in the second row. She asked him, it was the only thing left standing to ask, why then? Why the shudder that came down over his eyes that morning? Why December? Why the corridor, the 2 nods a day, the stranger's voice all winter? He was quiet the longest yet. The ice along the breakwater shifted and rang, far out, a sound like a struck kettle the size of a county. Then he said that he had buried his mother 3 weeks before that Monday, and he was not certain he could make anyone understand who had not stood where he stood, but he would try, because she was owed it. He had looked up from Fenn's introductions and seen the one face he had been hunting through every hospital on the West Shore. Found, delivered, 40 seconds down a corridor, and what had risen in him was not joy, it was terror. Everything he touched that autumn had come too late: the boat, the wire, the deathbed, the search. He had found her surname at last on a duty roster, and with it the certain knowledge of how his October leaving must have read to her, must have been reading to her for 5 mortal weeks, and he had thought, if I go to her now, in this building, with my mother 3 weeks in the ground and nothing in my hands but excuses, and she looks at me the way Alice's letter looked at me, that is the last door, and it shuts. So he had not gone. He had waited to be steadier, and the waiting made him less steady. He had waited for a right moment, and hospitals have none, and the weeks had piled up like the ice, each one making the silence heavier and the explanation more preposterous, until the man who had crossed a state looking for her could not cross a corridor. He who cut into living men for his bread and had the nerve for it, he could not cross a corridor. He said she was entitled to find that contemptible. He had found it contemptible himself, nightly, at the window at the end of the hall, looking up at the cemetery where the one woman who could have laughed him out of it lay, past laughing. And then, he said, 3 nights ago, a letter had fallen open on a floor, and he had learned in one line what her winter had been. That while he was nursing his terror up and down a 42nd corridor, she had been carrying his child behind a starched apron, alone, with a tin of biscuits behind her books and $140 between her and the ice. He had not slept since, he said, and it was not the sleeplessness of shock. It was the sleeplessness of a man doing sums again. Only this time, he said, the arithmetic had a living answer, and the answer was that every hour he spent being careful was an hour she spent being alone, and he was done, as of this evening, being careful. They had come to the end of Harbor Street, where the last lamp stood, and he stopped and faced her under it, and she saw that he had brought nothing. No ring got up in advance, no speech with corners on it, nothing but himself, hat in hand, 32 years old, with grief and winter all over him. What he asked was not what she had braced for. He did not ask her to marry him, not first. He said, he knew how a proposal made that night must look to her, like the decent thing, like arithmetic of another kind, a man squaring accounts. So before anything else he wanted her to hear the sentence he had come to say, and she could do with it what she liked. And he said it, that he had loved her since a veranda in October, since before there was any child to be decent about, and that the finding of her had been the whole object of his winter, and the losing of his nerve its whole shame, and that if she sent him off tonight, he would still be her servant in that building every day the board employed him, and her child would still want for nothing while he breathed, with no conditions attached to either. But that if she could imagine trusting him, not tonight, he said quickly, not all at once, he had not earned all at once, then he was asking leave to court her. Properly and openly, Ashport and her aunt and the Wednesday Aid Society be damned. He was asking for the time to become believable. That was the whole of his suit. Time. And Nora, who had had a winter's practice in hearing men's speeches for the machinery under them, and searched this one twice through, and found under it nothing but a frightened, exhausted, truthful man, heard herself say, out of the oldest part of her, that they hardly knew each other. 3 hours in October and 2 nods a day. He said then they would learn. He said, and here, for the first time that whole frozen evening, something that was almost a smile came into his voice, that they had, on excellent authority, enough time. She asked what authority. And he took her gloved hand, the thin-fingered hand that had held his by a dying fire, and turned it palm up, and she understood he meant the compass in her pocket, and the man who had given it to her, that he had held that little brass case by firelight in October, and turned it until the needle steadied, and thought, he had thought it that very night, he said, and been ashamed of the size of the thought, there. That is what it is. Not the noise, not the fiddles, not the careful life or the careless one, just find the one bearing that holds when everything swings, and steer standing. The lamp hissed above them. Out past the breakwater the ice rang again, the lake turning over in its sleep, enormous and indifferent and old. She had spent 5 years learning to need nothing. It had been good schooling, and she never afterward despised it. A woman must be able to stand alone before her standing with is worth anything. But her father had told her the truth at the end, when the fever let him up between waves. An anchor is not a harbor. She had the anchor. It was very deep in good ground, and here in the ringing cold stood the harbor, asking only to be sailed toward slowly. She said yes, to the courting, to the time, to all of it eventually, but that night only to the time, and he nodded gravely, as though she had granted exactly what he had asked and not 1 inch more, which was, she would think later, the first fully wise thing either of them ever did together. Then he walked her back up the hill to the corner of Prospect Avenue, to the corner only, correctness itself, while the whole absurdity of correctness at this hour of their story hung between them, and neither laughed, though it was near, and she went in past her aunt's dark parlor and up to her cold room, and sat on the bed, and found she was holding the compass so hard its rim had printed a red ring in her palm, like a seal on a letter. There remained the house on Prospect Avenue, and there was no bearing on any compass that led around it. They had agreed on honesty and on speed. The calendar allowed no leisurely siege. She would be 4 months gone by the end of February, and the dressmaker's ingenuities had a horizon. He offered to come with her. He was severe on the point, in fact. She refused him. She knew her aunt. Before witnesses, Josephine Brant would be all fortress. Alone, there was a chance, small but real, of finding a gate. She chose a Tuesday evening, the servants' night out, the two of them alone at the lamp with the mending basket between them like a hostage. And she told her aunt the whole of it, plainly, in order, sparing herself nothing. The wedding, the veranda, the night, the morning, the counting, Manitowoc, the winter of pockets and biscuit tins, the surgeon at the gate with his hat in his hands. She did not cry, and she did not defend herself, and she watched her aunt's face the way she had once watched the barometer on the petrol's bulkhead. What happened first was what she had braced for. Josephine set down the stocking she was darning with a terrible precision, as if it were made of blown glass, and for the better part of a minute said nothing at all. And then it came, not loud. Prospect Avenue was never loud, cold, exact, and comprehensive. That she had taken in her sister's daughter and stood surety for her before the whole town, and this was the note come due. That Nora had done what serving girls did, and might now expect what serving girls got. That the man's fine speeches were the standard issue of his kind, and would evaporate the first Sunday the congregation counted months on its fingers. That there was a home in Green Bay for cases of this sort, conducted by decent Lutheran women, and that if Nora went quietly and quickly, giving out a story of nursing a cousin, something might yet be salvaged, and that if she would not, then she had made her choice, and might consider that this house had done for her all it ever would. She could not think to call it hers after such a thing. The words were almost the very words Nora had imagined, lying awake, so nearly that she felt for a strange moment like a player who has heard the other part rehearsed through the wall. And perhaps that was why she was not destroyed by them. She sat still and let the silence come back, and then she did the one thing she had not planned. She asked her aunt a question. She asked why, in 5 years under this roof, through a father's death and a jilting and every cold economy of a dependent woman's life, her aunt had never once, not once, touched her. And whether the reason had anything to do with a small grave in the Lutheran churchyard at Manitowoc that no one in the family was ever taken to visit, though Nora had seen the entry, years ago as a girl, in the front of Grandmother Sullivan's Bible in faded ink. A daughter, born to Josephine in the March of 1858, 7 months, any child could do the sum, after the January wedding that made her a Brant, and dead at 2 days old. The lamp fizzed, the stove settled, and Nora watched 40 years of masonry come down, not with a crash, but the way a seawall goes, one stone, silently, and then the sea. Josephine did not weep. She was past the age and habit of it, she said later, the ducts themselves grown respectable. But she talked that night as she had never talked in Nora's hearing, in a voice Nora did not know, younger and flatter and stripped, and out it came, the thing the family had spent 4 decades not saying. 18 and in trouble, and the winter roads to the church a scandal clock ticking. Married in January in a dress let out at the waist by her own mother, who did not speak one unnecessary word to her from Advent to Easter. The baby coming early, at 7 months, in a hard march. 2 days of it, and then the little box, and the pastor choosing, as a kindness, everyone said, a text about the wages of things. And the lesson Josephine had taken into herself, with the March mud still on her boots, that the fault had been softness, that she had been soft and the world had corrected her, and that she would be granite from that hour, and her house granite, and her name granite, and nothing she loved would ever again give the world a purchase to strike her by. She had been granite 40 years. She had buried a husband and kept his books and his standing, raised no more children, permitted herself no more weather. And when her dead sister's girl had come to her, grieving and disgraceful in nothing and dangerous only in being loved, she had done the one thing granite can do. She had housed her, correctly, at arm's length, and called the arm's length virtue. She said, and this was the sentence Nora carried out of that room and kept, that she had spent 40 years believing God had punished her for the night that made the child, and had understood only lately, watching Nora come and go all winter with her secret, for she had known, she said flatly. She had let out waistbands herself once, and knew the look of a woman doing sums. She had known since Christmas and said nothing, and let the girl carry it alone, and that was the cruelty she would answer for. Understood only now, too late for her own case, that the punishment had never been the child. The punishment was everything she had built after. It was not a reconciliation, quite. Granite does not become water in an evening. Josephine still thought the thing a catastrophe. She still said so, twice. But at the end of that long, lamp-lit Tuesday, she climbed the stairs, and was gone some time, and came down with a flat parcel wrapped in blue tissue that had been wrapped a very long time, and put it in Nora's hands without ceremony. It was lace, a wedding veil of Limerick lace, yellowed at the folds like old ivory. It had been Bridget's, their mother's before her. It had crossed from Ireland in a trunk lid. Josephine had not worn it. There had been no veil that January, and Bridget, marrying her penniless captain against advice, had not been offered it. It had lain in tissue through both weddings and both funerals, waiting, Josephine said, for the family to produce one bride who was neither shamed nor stolen. She was done waiting, she said. Nora would wear it, and she would wear it in Ashport, in the church, by daylight. And any lady of the Wednesday Aid Society who wished to count months on her fingers might come and do it to Josephine Brandt's face in her front parlor, where she received on Thursdays. They were married the last Saturday of February, 1899, in the Congregational Church, a small wedding, and the town supplied the commentary free of charge. Nora heard the best of it later from Katie, who collected such things. The dry goods clerk who wondered aloud at the haste, and Mrs. Pruitt, buying flannel at the next counter, remarking to no one in particular that in 30 years of hospital work she had observed that the people most anxious about other folks' arithmetic were generally those with the least sums of their own worth doing. The clerk found something to do in the stockroom. As for Mr. Cyrus Hobart, who never learned how near he had stood to a very different winter, he married a schoolteacher from Kewanee before the year was out, and was reported entirely content. Alice came down from Eastman's Landing with her clerk, and wept and laughed and wept, and took Nora's hands at the church door, and said she supposed she must forgive herself now for that frosty letter she had once written a strange man from Chicago, since, as it proved, she had been guarding the door of the very house he was trying to come home to. Dr. Fenn gave the bride away, awkward and pink and pleased, in place of the captain who could not. And Josephine Brandt sat in the second pew in gray silk, straight as a lighthouse, and if her eyes were wet, no one was ever able to prove it. And one lady who leaned toward her with a delicate question about dates received the full, unblinking Sullivan stare and inquired after nothing further, then or ever. Nora wore the veil. Through the yellowed lace, the church candles looked like harbor lights seen through weather, and she thought of her mother, who had worn no veil and sung in kitchens, and of a girl in a let-out January dress 40 years back, and she understood she was carrying all of them down that aisle, the shamed and the stolen and the silent, every woman of her line who had loved at the world's inconvenience, and that this, perhaps, was what the old lace had been kept for. Not the triumph, the company. At the step her husband, the word still new in her mouth like a foreign coin, turned to her, and she saw his eyes go, once, quick as a pickpocket, to the little lump her gloved hand made against her prayer book, where anyone else would have carried a handkerchief. And the corner of his mouth moved, and neither of them said compass, in church, before God and the Wednesday Aid Society. But it rode down the aisle with them all the same, brass and steady, pointing where it always pointed. They took the Ehlers house on Bay Street, 4 rooms and a porch with the water showing between the roofs, and set about the work he had asked for on the coldest night of the winter, the work of becoming known to each other, in the ordinary daylight way, on the far side of vows that most couples make on the near side. It went as such work goes, unevenly, and better than either had dared budget for. They quarreled. She noted it almost with relief, the first time as one notes sound rigging in a squall. He was untalkative when tired, and she had 5 years' habit of reading silence as leaving, and the first month those two flints struck sparks enough. But he quarreled fair, without speeches, and she learned that his silences ended at the supper table of their own accord if she did not go fishing in them. And he learned that when his wife polished brass at 10 in the evening, she was not house-proud, but troubled, and that the remedy was not to ask what was wrong, but to stand alongside and dry. He learned she liked oranges. She had said it once, in passing, in March, that she had had an orange every Christmas of her girlhood, her father's invariable treasure from the Chicago run, and had never since tasted one without hearing gulls. She thought no more of it. But the fruit crates came up from Chicago on the same steamers that had once carried the petrel's trade, and from that week there were oranges in the blue bowl on the sideboard, always, replenished without remark, the way the tide is replenished, and she never learned what standing order at Meyer's grocery accomplished it, and did not ask, because some accounts are better left unexamined by the heart that profits from them. On Sundays in the spring they walked up the hill to the cemetery, the two graves being, by one of the town's quieter mercies, 60 feet apart on the same slope, the captain under his anchor and chain, and Helen Marsh Ward under her new granite, with the first grass coming in over her like a returning memory of the county she had talked of for 30 years in a Chicago flat. Nora weeded them both, kneeling awkwardly as the spring advanced, and the kneeling became a negotiation. Nathaniel stood by with his hat off and sometimes talked to the headstones a little, in the dry, unembarrassed way of a man whose profession has left him on practical terms with death. He told his mother the news, chiefly. Nora liked to listen to it. It was how she learned the small things, that Helen had sung in the Lutheran choir at 16, that she had once, at 90 pounds and 5 feet 1, backed a drunken tannery foreman out of her father's yard with a hayfork, that her last clear sentence in Chicago, 2 days before the end, had been an instruction to her son to go north for the wedding, because, she had said it in the old country dialect of her girlhood, a lamp is no use in the lamp shop. Carry it where it is dark. The boy was born the first week of July, in the front bedroom on Bay Street, in the middle of a white-hot morning with the lake flat as pewter, a big, indignant, red-headed son, with his grandfather's lungs. The midwife said she had not heard such a foghorn in 20 years of the trade. They named him Thomas Helm Ward, Thomas for the captain. Helm because Nora would not saddle a Wisconsin schoolboy with Helen, and wanted her aboard nonetheless. And the town, which had spent February counting on its fingers, came around exactly as fast as towns do, which is to say the moment there was a baby to bend over. By August, the same ladies who had wondered at the haste were disputing the ownership of his smiles, and Mrs. Pruitt had knit him 3 pairs of boots, in wool, in graduated sizes, like a woman provisioning a voyage, because, she said, children and winters both come on faster than anybody plans for, and she had never yet been sorry to be ahead of either. Josephine came on Thursdays. It was, of course, her receiving day, and for 40 years no power on the lakeshore had moved her from her own parlor on a Thursday, and no one but Nora ever fully priced what the change of address meant. She came in gray silk and sat correctly, and held the baby correctly, and criticized the nursery arrangements in detail. And Nora watched her aunt's granite hands cradle the small red head, and watched the old face over it when Josephine thought herself unobserved, and held her peace. In October, when Thomas took the croup and the house went sleepless, it was Josephine who appeared unsummoned with her sleeves rolled, and sat up 3 nights in the steam-filled kitchen spelling the two of them, immovable as a breakwater. And at gray dawn on the 3rd morning, when the little chest finally loosened and the cough broke and the house breathed again, Nora came into the kitchen and found her aunt asleep in the chair with the baby on her shoulder and her cheek fallen sideways against the small, damp head, touching him in her sleep, the way she had touched no one for 40 years upright. Nora stood in the doorway a long minute. Then she went out again on stocking feet and let them be. Some mendings are best done in the dark, unwatched, like the setting of old bones. Of Frank Colby there is only this much left to tell, that he was passed over for cashier that same autumn in favor of a man from Fond du Lac, and grew stout, and that when Nora met him at last face to face on Harbor Street, she with the pram, he with his gloves, he was correct and cordial and could not for the life of him keep his eyes from doing their own arithmetic, tallying what he had traded away against what the shares had bought. And Nora wished him a good morning that was entirely sincere, and walked on, and realized at the corner, with a lightness like the first day off a sickbed, that she had felt nothing at all. Not triumph. Nothing. That old account had simply closed. There are debts the heart forgives and debts it merely outgrows. And she had stopped caring which this one was, which is the surest sign of either. On an evening at the very end of that summer, Thomas asleep upstairs, the season's last excursion steamer hooting off the point, the sky doing its long northern goodbye over the water, Nora sat on the porch steps with her father's compass open in her hand. She did that some evenings. Habit of a lifetime. She was done apologizing for it. The brass was worn to a soft gold now at the rim, from 4 pockets, her father's and hers, and the one evening it had written in a stranger's hand by firelight, and the future in which she already knew it would ride in a red-headed boy's. The flaw in the glass still caught the low light like a frozen tear. The needle still trembled before it settled. It always would. That was not a defect, her father had told her once, watching her frown at it as a child. A needle that never trembled was a needle stuck fast and no use to anyone. You did not want a compass that felt nothing. You wanted one that felt everything, every lurch and swing of the whole heaving world, and settled true anyway. She had thought at 10 that he was talking about compasses. She had thought at 19, boarding the Milwaukee train with the case new in her pocket, that North meant her profession, the steady hands, the counted drops, the being the calmest thing in the room. And it had meant that for a long while, and the meaning had held her up through years when nothing else offered. Then she had thought, in the gray morning at the Lakeview house, that there was no North at all, that the needle spun for everyone and the trick was expecting nothing of it. She had been wrong each time, she saw now, in the particular way a chart is wrong, not lying, only incomplete, awaiting the parts of the coast she had not sailed yet. Behind her the screen door opened. Her husband came out with his pipe unlit. He never lit it until she said the mosquitoes were bad, a small standing treaty of the porch, and sat down on the step beside her, close, his shoulder against hers, and saw what was in her hand, and asked no question. He had learned that too. Away north, past the breakwater light, a schooner was standing down the shore under shortened canvas, one of the last of them, her sails taking the sunset the way old lace takes candlelight. They watched her out of sight together, and Nora turned the little case until the needle steadied, and thought that her father had known the whole of it all along, and had put it in her hand the only way one generation can ever put anything in the hand of the next, folded small, in brass, waiting for the years to translate it. A sailor is never lost while he knows where North lies. Not the lake, Papa, she knew that now. North was the child asleep in the room under the eaves, and the man breathing quietly at her shoulder, and the granite aunt who came on Thursdays, and the graves keeping their gentle company on the hill. North was the whole small, mortal harborage of things that a frightened woman had almost been too careful ever to sail for. The needle had trembled all winter. It had felt everything, and it had settled true, and she was home. She closed the compass. The click of the little brass lid was the quietest sound on the whole darkened shore, and it said what the last line of any true account says, whether of a voyage or a life. Arrived safe. All well, nothing owing. The end.